The wind always howled a particular tune around the cliffside research station, a constant, mournful drone that vibrated through the reinforced concrete walls. Tonight, it felt more insistent, carrying the deep rumble of waves crashing against the rocks far below. I could hear it even through the insulated glass of my observation bay, a wild symphony that underscored the profound silence of the cosmos I was trying to interrogate. It was just me, the hum of the servers, and the occasional hiss of radio static from an auxiliary monitor, a white noise backdrop to the infinite black. I leaned closer to the primary display, my breath fogging the cool glass for a moment before dissipating. My eyes, accustomed to the dim glow of screens, scanned the spectral readouts. Weeks of meticulous calibration, of fine-tuning the new generation deep space observatory, had culminated in this. I was searching for the faint whispers of ancient stellar nurseries, the echoes of cosmic dawn. What I found, or rather what found me, was something else entirely. It started subtly, a barely perceptible ripple in the background noise. A single sharp peak on a frequency band that should have been utterly flat, a ghost of a signal in a region of space designated as empty. Not just empty of stars, but empty of even the scattered hydrogen atoms that drift between galaxies. I scoffed, a dry sound in the quiet room. Probably a fluke. I told myself, a stray cosmic ray or an internal sensor hiccup. The observatory was cutting edge, yes, but even the best instruments could glitch. I ran a quick diagnostic on the receiving array, watching the system logs scroll by. Green. Every component was operating within optimal parameters. No anomalies reported. I sighed, scrubbing a hand over my tired face. It was past 3 in the morning, the kind of hour where the mind played tricks, where patterns emerged from randomness with a little too much zeal. I told myself to ignore it, to reset the filter and move on. But then it happened again. Not the same peak, not a simple repetition, but a new, distinct signature, a complex, almost melodic rise and fall of frequencies, then another, then a series of sharp, staccato bursts. My fingers hovered over the console. This wasn't random noise. Cosmic background radiation was diffuse, predictable. Pulsars had their rhythmic beats. Quasars screamed their specific, chaotic songs. This was different. It felt like a deliberate sequence, though utterly alien in its structure. My initial dismissal evaporated, replaced by a prickle of unease that crawled up my spine. It was supposed to be a vacuum, a barren stretch of the universe utterly devoid of anything capable of generating such a signal. I isolated the signal, stripping away all known cosmic interference. The raw data that emerged was unsettling. It wasn't a static burst, nor a repeating pattern. Each pulse, each intricate fluctuation was unique. It was as if something was speaking, but in a language so utterly foreign, so devoid of any recognizable structure, that my mind struggled to even categorize it as data. A tremor, almost imperceptible, ran through my hand as I adjusted the gain, trying to sharpen the waveform. I could feel the tension tightening in my shoulders, a knot forming at the base of my neck. My focus narrowed to the screen, the glowing green lines dancing a silent, incomprehensible ballet. It defied every principle of astrophysics I had ever studied, every model of cosmic evolution. It was an anomaly so profound it felt like a deliberate taunt, a cosmic joke played on the fragile edifice of human understanding. A bizarre quantum fluctuation on an unprecedented scale. My rational mind scrambled for explanations, but each one felt flimsy, inadequate. I spent another hour, perhaps 2, lost in the data. The signal didn't stop. It continued its impossible transmission, a steady, unwavering presence from the heart of nothingness. I tried to find any terrestrial interference, any satellite bleed, any terrestrial radio waves bouncing off the ionosphere. Nothing. The signal was clean, pure, and undeniably extraterrestrial in its origin point. Finally, with a deep, shuddering breath, I knew I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't just a glitch. It was a thing. I initiated a full data capture, logging every byte of the impossible transmission. This wasn't just a discovery, it felt like an intrusion. What exactly had I just found, and what was it trying to say? The thick, reinforced glass of my office window, the endless, gray expanse of the ocean stretched out, meeting a sky the same color. I'd always found the cliffside research station a place of profound solitude, its isolation a necessary shield against the distractions of the world below. Tonight, however, the solitude felt less like a shield and more like a deepening well. My eyes, gritty with hours of focus, traced the lines of data scrolling across my primary monitor. The air in the observation chamber was cool, smelling faintly of ozone and stale coffee, a familiar comfort that was starting to feel like a cage. The low hum of the servers, a constant thrum beneath the floor, vibrated up through my chair, a steady pulse that usually soothed me. But today it felt like a growing pressure behind my ears. I'd spent the last 24 hours, practically uninterrupted, sifting through the initial burst of data, the impossible anomaly. My colleague, a pragmatic man who trusted only what he could touch, had already dismissed it as an equipment glitch, a burst of cosmic rays, anything but what it truly seemed to be. He'd left hours ago, probably to his quiet home in the valley, oblivious to the strange current that had seized my attention. The only other sound, apart from the distant waves crashing and the server hum, was the ever-present whisper of radio static from the auxiliary comms, a white noise I usually filtered out. Tonight it seemed to carry a strange, almost rhythmic undertone, a faint, unheard chorus just at the edge of my perception. The initial scan had been a fluke, a serendipitous alignment of sensors pointing into a patch of cosmic nothingness, the vast, cold void between the colossal superclusters, a region astrophysicists typically labeled as empty. But it wasn't empty, not anymore. I zoomed in on a segment, then another. My fingers danced across the keyboard, calling up algorithms, running filters. I was searching for the telltale signature of a pulsar, a black hole accretion disk, even some bizarre, undiscovered stellar phenomenon. Anything that fit, nothing fit. The signal wasn't a simple frequency sweep. It wasn't a burst of electromagnetic radiation, nor a ripple in space-time. It defied classification. My instruments, calibrated to detect every known form of energy, registered it as something else. It presented itself as a complex, multi-layered data stream, a tapestry woven from threads that didn't exist in our known spectrum. Each layer seemed to be modulating the next, an intricate dance of patterns that shifted and reformed with an unsettling fluidity. My brow furrowed. I pulled up the raw data again, stripped of all processing, just the pure, unadulterated feed. There, embedded within the seemingly chaotic noise, was a structure. Not a repeating pulse, not a simple mathematical sequence, but something far more elaborate. It was like finding a fully formed sentence in a random arrangement of letters. Then another and another. My breath hitched. The patterns weren't random. They were too specific, too deliberate. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool glass of the monitor. The patterns weren't merely complex, they possessed an internal logic, a coherence that spoke of intent. It wasn't a natural phenomenon. Natural phenomena, even the most intricate, always had an element of stochasticity, of inherent randomness. This didn't. This was precise. This was designed. My hands trembled slightly as I ran a pattern recognition algorithm I developed years ago for analyzing distant stellar nurseries. It was meant to identify nascent structures within cosmic dust clouds. Here it found structures within the signal itself. Layer upon layer, each one more intricate than the last, building upon preceding ones. It was like observing the growth of a crystalline fractal, but one that seemed to expand not through natural law, but through some unseen, deliberate will. The radio static in the background seemed to swell, a faint, almost imperceptible shift in its hum. I glanced at the comms console, but the frequency hadn't changed. It was just the usual noise, wasn't it? This wasn't just a signal. This was information. Intelligent information. And it wasn't coming from a star or a galaxy or any place I understood. A place where nothing should exist, let alone think. The implications began to claw at the edges of my rational mind. If this was intelligent, what kind of intelligence could survive in that utter desolation? What kind of entity could communicate across such impossible distances, using methods unknown to science? I pushed away from the desk, standing up to pace the small office. The waves crashing outside seemed to mock my agitation, their relentless rhythm a stark contrast to the impossibly intricate, deliberate pulses I was witnessing on my screen. This wasn't a message in the traditional sense. It wasn't a binary code or a mathematical prime sequence or any of the universal languages we'd theorized for interstellar communication. This was something else. It was a language of pure structure, of self-organizing complexity that defied all known physics, yet undeniably was. The next few days blurred into an endless cycle of data analysis and caffeine. I stopped answering calls from the station director, a stern woman who valued strict adherence to protocol. I ignored the concerned glances of the maintenance crew who occasionally walked past my open door. Meals became an afterthought, a quick protein bar consumed while staring at the monitors. I was no longer merely observing, I was attempting to interact. I began to feed segments of the signal back into a modified emitter, a crude attempt to acknowledge its presence to see if it would react. My experiments yielded nothing discernible, no immediate change in the incoming data stream. Yet the patterns continued to unfold, layer after layer, revealing an internal architecture so vast, so ancient, it made the oldest stars seem like fleeting sparks. It wasn't just old, it was elder. It didn't feel like a beacon, a desperate cry for contact. It felt like a quiet, continuous exhalation, a presence that simply was, and the more I delved, the more I felt a profound, unsettling shift within myself. The universe I thought I knew, the one governed by predictable laws and observable phenomena, was fracturing. My fingers hovered over the console, poised to run another, more aggressive diagnostic. What if the signal wasn't just transmitting information, but subtly rearranging the very fabric of my understanding? What if its presence, its sheer age, was a pressure, shaping my perceptions in ways I couldn't yet comprehend? The gray light of dawn was a cold balm against the glass of my office window, yet offered no real comfort. The cliffside research station felt less like a sanctuary and more like a cage now, its isolation amplifying every unsettling thought that had taken root during the long, sleepless night. The endless expanse of ocean still met a sky the same muted color, but the familiar sight no longer soothed me. Instead, it felt like a vast, indifferent eye watching my every move. I'd spent hours poring over the data, rerunning algorithms, checking every parameter, every filter. The signal remained. A complex, layered symphony of impossible frequencies, originating from a region of space that should have been utterly barren. The void. My colleagues, the few who even bothered to check my work, had dismissed it as an elaborate error, a phantom reading born of faulty equipment or a stray cosmic ray. I knew better. My instruments, meticulously calibrated, hummed with an almost unnatural precision. And the signal, it wasn't random. It possessed an intricate, non-repeating structure that defied any natural astronomical phenomenon. It felt deliberate. The fluorescent lights above my workstation flickered, a stuttering cough in the quiet hum of the room. I barely registered it at first, attributing it to the aging power grid that fed the remote station. Then it happened again, a longer, more pronounced blink that plunged the room into a momentary gloom before snapping back to full brightness. My monitors, usually steadfast, glitched, a ripple of static washing across the displays before settling. I leaned closer, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. It felt responsive, as if the surge wasn't a malfunction but a resonance. Outside, the steady rhythm of the waves crashing against the cliff seemed to alter, a subtle shift in pitch, a deeper, more resonant thrum that vibrated through the very foundations of the station. It wasn't louder, just different, as if the ocean itself was holding a deeper, slower breath. The radio static from the comms array in the corner, usually a low, unobtrusive hiss, grew sharper, a crackle that seemed to bite at the air. I reached out, my hand brushing against the cold metal of the console. A jolt, not electrical, but something akin to a phantom tremor, ran up my arm. My skin prickled. A sharp, metallic tang filled my nostrils like ozone mixed with something ancient and damp, something that had been sealed away for millennia. I rubbed my temples, a dull ache throbbing behind my eyes. Lack of sleep, I told myself. The constant strain. But the scent persisted, a subtle invasion. Then a flicker at the edge of my vision. It moved, a sinuous ripple, before vanishing the instant I turned my head directly towards it. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, my eyes scanning the empty wall, the familiar bookshelves. Nothing. Just the faint hum of the servers and the distant, unsettling cadence of the ocean. My heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic drum against my ribs. I pushed back from my desk, the squeal of my chair echoing in the sudden quiet. The air in the office felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me. I needed to move to break the spell. I walked over to the terminal that accessed the station's archived records, a dusty, rarely used database of obscure historical astronomical observations and theoretical physics papers. Scans of ancient, brittle texts, some translated from forgotten languages, others merely fragmentary notes from rogue researchers decades, even centuries ago. One particular entry, a scanned page from a leather-bound journal dated to the late 18th century, detailed accounts from a fringe philosophical society. They believed that the emptiness between the stars was not truly empty, but inhabited by elder intelligences that slumbered, their dreams occasionally rippling through reality. They claimed these entities could subtly alter perception, twisting the familiar until it became alien. My eyes scanned the cryptic passages, my fingers tracing the faded script on the screen. Those who listen, one line read, shall perceive the world as a thin veil easily torn. As I read, the radio static in the corner of my office suddenly surged, a violent burst of white noise that made me flinch. And in that momentary dimness, reflected on the glass of my screen, I saw it again. Not just a long, slender one, but a complex, shifting pattern, like a tapestry woven from the absence of light, undulating just behind my own reflection. It was impossible, a trick of the eye, a tired mind playing games. I whipped around, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. The office was empty, the familiar furniture solid and still. The lights hummed back to full brightness, the radio static settled into its usual low hiss, and the waves crashing outside returned to their mundane, rhythmic roar. Everything was normal. Yet, the metallic tang still lingered in the air, and the image of that impossible reflection was seared into my mind. The text spoke of perception shifting. What if the signal wasn't just a broadcast, but a key slowly unlocking a different way of seeing? And in that momentary dimness, reflected on the glass, I saw it. Not an image, not a shape I could name, but a ripple. A momentary warping of the office, a fleeting distortion that made the familiar angles of my desk and monitors bend inwards, as if the air itself had momentarily liquefied. It was gone before my breath caught, swallowed by the returning flood of light as the overhead fluorescent sputtered back to life, buzzing with renewed, sickly energy. My reflection stared back at me wide-eyed, a man caught between the certainty of what he knew and the sudden, terrifying possibility of something else entirely. I rubbed my eyes, the gritty sensation a welcome anchor. My fingers trembled slightly. Was it just a trick of the light? A residual image from the flicker? The radio static in the corner, though, continued its low, insistent hiss, a constant reminder of the unseen forces at play in my isolated cliffside research station, waves crashing against the rocks far below. The relentless rhythm of the ocean was usually a comfort, a predictable counterpoint to the unpredictable universe I studied. Now even that seemed to carry an undertone of something vast and indifferent. That night, sleep offered no escape. It came in fragments, a mosaic of impossible sensation. I found myself adrift in a space that was not dark, but rather an absence of light so profound it felt like a pressure. Geometries unfolded before me, structures of pure thought that defied Euclidean principles. Angles shifted and reformed, lines converged where they should diverge, creating impossible edifices that twisted into themselves, vast and silent. They were not built of stone or metal, but of a substance that resonated with an ancient, cold awareness. I felt rather than saw the scale of them, a crushing immensity that made my own existence feel like a speck of dust on an infinite, indifferent canvas. Then came the presences. Not forms, not entities with definable shapes, but an overwhelming feeling of being observed. It wasn't malicious, not in any human sense, but utterly, terrifyingly alien. It simply was, and its existence dwarfed everything I understood. My breath hitched in my dream throat. I tried to scream, but no sound escaped. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them again. The room was normal, just a dream, a very, very vivid dream, but the dreams continued night after night. Each one more detailed, more overwhelming. The geometries became more complex, the sense of vast, slumbering presence more acute. I started to see them even when I was awake. At first it was subtle. I'd blink hard and it would be gone, just my eyes playing tricks, I'd tell myself. The result of too many late nights staring at cosmic microwave background radiation maps. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the latest data streams, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor ran through the floor of the cliffside research station. The radio static in the corner seemed to crackle with renewed intensity, a tiny, almost subliminal spike. I looked up, my gaze drawn to the far wall. For a fraction of a second, the solid concrete seemed to soften, its texture rippling like water. And within that ripple, I caught a glimpse of something behind it. Not the interior of the wall, but a flash of those impossible angles, a deep, unsettling violet black that seemed to absorb all light. It was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving the concrete wall stubbornly, reassuringly solid. My hands felt clammy, my breath hitched. Was I finally losing it? There was the isolation, the relentless pursuit of an anomaly finally eroding my mind. I walked to the wall, touching the cool, rough surface. It felt real, unyielding. What did I really see? It was a momentary warping of the office, a fleeting distortion that made the familiar angles of my desk and monitors bend inwards, as if the air itself had momentarily liquefied. My breath hitched. Then just as swiftly it vanished, leaving the room exactly as it had been, the fluorescent lights humming their dull, unwavering tune. I blinked, rubbing at my eyes, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. A trick of the light, I told myself, or perhaps the late hours finally catching up to me. My mind, usually a fortress of logic, felt suddenly porous, susceptible to phantom impressions. I spent the next 2 days meticulously rechecking every sensor, every calibration, every line of code. The signal, the impossible ancient hum from the void, remained. My data was irrefutable. My sanity, however, felt less certain. The ripple, the brief visual aberration, lingered in my memory like a stain. The time came to present my findings. I stood before the small, skeptical panel of senior researchers in the main conference room at the Cliffside Research Station. Waves crashing, radio static, a steady, rhythmic roar just beyond the thick glass windows. The air inside felt heavy, charged with unspoken doubt. My voice, usually clear and confident, felt like a stranger's, thin and reedy as I laid out the spectral analysis, the gravitational anomalies, the sheer impossibility of the signal's origin. Subjective experiences. I hesitated, the words catching in my throat. How could I describe the ripple, the sense of being watched? The subtle shifts in my own perception that felt less like fatigue and more like a gentle, insidious retuning of my very senses. I stammered, trying to articulate the fleeting visual distortions, the way the light sometimes seemed to cling to surfaces differently, or the ambient sounds of the station, the distant clatter of machinery. The incessant radio static would momentarily warp, stretching or compressing in a way that defied acoustics. A colleague, a stern woman with a reputation for meticulous rigor, cleared him throat. Raj, my data on the signal itself is compelling, if extraordinary, but these personal observations, these subjective experiences I mention, they don't belong in a scientific presentation. Her tone was polite, but her eyes held a flicker of concern that felt like a judgment. The head of research, a man whose career was built on cautious, incremental discoveries, leaned forward. We understand the pressure of such an intense project, Raj. Perhaps a break is in order. They weren't hearing me. They were seeing a man on the verge, not a scientist with a groundbreaking, terrifying discovery. This isn't fatigue, I insisted, my voice rising. This is part of it. The signal, the presence. It's affecting reality, my reality. I gestured wildly at the projection of the signal's waveform, a complex fractal pattern that seemed to shimmer with an inner life. It's not just a signal, it's an awareness from beyond. The room fell silent. The head of research exchanged a look with the colleague. A quiet, unspoken consensus settled between them. My words, meant to convey urgency and truth, had only cemented their conclusion. I was unraveling. My project, once a source of fascination, became a liability. The isolation began subtly. Emails went unanswered. My calls to discuss further data were politely deflected. I was still allowed access to the Cliffside Research Station, waves crashing, radio static humming its monotonous tune, but my presence felt tolerated rather than welcomed. My colleagues, once eager to debate the intricacies of stellar nurseries, now avoided my gaze, their expressions a mix of pity and discomfort. They saw a brilliant mind succumbing to delusion, not a pioneer facing an unimaginable truth. Alone in my office, the rhythmic crash of the waves against the cliffs below became a constant, mocking reminder of the world I was being pushed out of. The radio static from the comm system felt like a blanket of white noise, muffling everything but the insistent thrum of the signal in my own mind. I pored over my data, searching for any conventional explanation, any flaw in my logic, anything that would bring me back from the precipice of scientific heresy. There was nothing. My determination, once fueled by academic curiosity, now festered into a desperate, gnawing obsession. If mainstream science refused to acknowledge what I had found, then I would look elsewhere. I started with obscure historical accounts of astronomical anomalies, then moved to forgotten philosophical treatises on the nature of reality and perception. My searches grew more frantic, delving into digital archives of discredited theories, fringe interpretations of ancient texts, and even collections of folklore that hinted at entities beyond human comprehension. I sought out the discarded, the ridiculed, the forbidden. Late one night, hunched over a glowing screen, the only sound the insistent radio static from the adjacent comms room and the ceaseless waves crashing outside, I found it. A digitized collection of fragmented manuscripts from a forgotten sect, dating back millennia. They described these entities not as gods or demons, but as vast, indifferent presences whose awakening caused subtle, terrifying shifts in existence, manifesting as shimmering air and bending light echoes of my own subjective experiences. The texts warned of the dangers of seeking them out, of the unraveling mind that dared to glimpse their true nature. Was it possible? Could humanity have glimpsed this truth before, only to forget it, or bury it under layers of convenient disbelief? And if so, what did that mean for me, for my discovery, for the world that now refused to listen? The head of research and the colleague had walked away, their footsteps fading down the corridor of the cliffside research station. My project, they decided, was a dead end. Worse, it was a danger to my own stability. The implication hung in the heavy air. I was losing my grip. But their judgment, rather than deterring me, only sharpened my resolve. They saw a man unraveling. I saw a man finally seeing. I returned to my console, the glow of the screens reflecting in the thick glass of the window, beyond which the infinite dark of the ocean stretched, waves crashing against the rocks below. The persistent, low hiss of radio static was a constant companion now, a white noise backdrop to the alien presence I hunted. The isolation of the cliffside research station, waves crashing, radio static, was no longer a comfort. It was a crucible. They had cut my access to the main processing clusters, but they hadn't stripped me of my own workstation, my own algorithms, or my own fierce, gnawing curiosity. I had saved the raw data, the peculiar frequency shifts, the impossible patterns that defied all known astrophysics. Days blurred into a single, extended vigil. Coffee became a forgotten luxury, replaced by the bitter taste of exhaustion and an almost manic focus. My fingers flew across the keyboard, refining old programs, writing new ones, searching for a key, a Rosetta Stone that would unlock the signal's impossible syntax. The signal itself was a labyrinth. It wasn't a conventional broadcast, not a stream of information encoded in waves. It was something else entirely, a resonance, a vibration that seemed to pluck at the very fabric of space-time. My initial attempts to break it down into recognizable components, mathematical sequences, harmonic progressions yielded nothing but chaotic noise, a digital scream. But I felt a pull, a subtle, insistent hum in the back of my mind, a whisper that wasn't sound but pure intuition. It felt less like I was analyzing data and more like I was being guided. One evening, as a storm gathered offshore and the wind howled like a hungry beast, rattling the windows of the cliffside research station, waves crashing, radio static, I hit upon a new approach. I stopped trying to force human logic onto the patterns. Instead, I built an algorithm designed to identify discontinuities, abrupt shifts in the underlying texture of the signal, moments where the resonance changed its very nature. It was a desperate, almost poetic gamble. The program ran, churning through terabytes of captured data. Hours crawled by. The only sounds were the distant roar of the ocean, the rhythmic click of my keyboard, and the increasingly frantic whir of the workstation's cooling fans. My eyes burned, my head throbbed, but I couldn't look away from the scrolling lines of code, the fluctuating graphs. Then a flicker. A sequence of symbols, not letters, not numbers, but intricate, self-contained glyphs appeared on the screen. They weren't static. They pulsed with a faint internal light, shifting and reforming in subtle ways that defied any stable representation. My breath hitched. This wasn't a language I could read, but I felt it somehow. I felt its meaning. I isolated the sequence, zooming in. The glyphs began to resolve, not into distinct forms, but into swirling, complex patterns that seemed to contain information rather than merely represent it. It was like looking at a fractal, each layer revealing a new, terrifying depth. My mind reeled, trying to grasp what I was seeing. And then it happened. Not a translation, not a deciphering in the traditional sense, but a sudden, violent download. The concepts didn't arrive as words or images, but as pure, unadulterated knowing. It was as if a foreign consciousness had momentarily breached the walls of my own mind, depositing fragments of its own perspective directly into my awareness. The first concept was scale, not just vastness, but an overwhelming, crushing sense of cosmic indifference. I felt with a clarity that threatened to shatter my skull the true unimaginable immensity of the universe. We were less than dust, less than a thought, utterly irrelevant. The second concept was time, not the linear progression we understand, but an endless, cyclical unfolding, vast epochs stretching into eternities that rendered human history, all of it, a fleeting, imperceptible breath. There were things that were, before stars, before galaxies, things that had endured unmoving through countless cosmic births and deaths. Things that still were, patiently. And the third, the most horrifying, was presence. It was teeming, not with life as we knew it, but with entities of such unfathomable age and power that the very concept of life was a pathetic joke. They weren't malevolent in a human sense, they simply existed. We were beneath their notice, beneath their contempt. We were less than microbes to a mountain, less than echoes in a chasm. We were a momentary disturbance, a faint tremor on a colossal ancient skin, soon to be smoothed away. My vision blurred. My hands trembled, fingers still hovering over the keyboard. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unspoken truth. The radio static intensified, a crackling roar in my ears, as if the very air itself was struggling to contain the enormity of what I had just perceived. I gasped, a dry, ragged sound. My throat was tight, my chest burning. This wasn't information, it was an infection of understanding. My universe, my neat, orderly cosmos of laws and particles, had just been ripped apart and replaced by something ancient, terrifying, and utterly alien. My perception of reality had been redefined, irrevocably. What other truths lay hidden within that impossible signal, waiting to be downloaded directly into my screaming mind? The footsteps of the head of research and the colleague had long since faded, swallowed by the sterile silence of the corridor. They'd made their judgment, dismissed my work as a dead end, my mind as unstable. Unstable. The word echoed hollow in the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the distant rumble of the ocean. They saw a man unraveling. I saw a man finally seeing. Their dismissal, rather than disheartening me, had simply sharpened my focus. It was a clear sign. I was on my own. No more distractions, no more attempts to explain the inexplicable to minds too rigid to comprehend. I was free to descend into the signal's depths, unburdened by their limited perspectives. Days blurred into a single, unbroken stretch of flickering screens and the low hum of equipment. Sleep became a forgotten luxury, a concept as alien as the signal itself. I'd catch myself drifting, my head lolling against the cool metal of the console, only to be jolted awake by a sudden spike in the data, a fresh fragment of the impossible language clicking into place. Each new deciphered phrase was a key, not just to understanding the signal, but to unlocking something within myself. It felt less like learning and more like remembering, a dormant part of my mind stirring, stretching, and then seeing. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and the veins beneath my eyes stood out like bruised rivers. I'd lost weight, I knew, but hunger was an abstract concept now, easily ignored. My body felt like a vessel, a temporary housing for a mind consumed by something far grander than mere biological needs. The detachment began subtly. A colleague passing by my lab door would offer a perfunctory greeting, a worried glance. I'd nod, maybe mumble a reply, but their words felt like background noise, their concerns trivial. My responses became clipped, my gaze distant. I could see the unease in their eyes, the way they'd quickly move on, but it didn't bother me. Their world felt small, increasingly irrelevant. The signal was changing me, not just mentally, but physically. A low thrum had taken root behind my sternum, a vibration that seemed to synchronize with the pulse of the deciphered data. And the radio static. It wasn't just white noise anymore. Then came the distortions. At first, I dismissed them as fatigue, a trick of the light. The subtle bending of a straight line, the edge of my desk appearing to curve inward just for a moment before snapping back. I'd blink, rub my eyes, and they would vanish, leaving me to question my own perception. One evening, as the last of the station's staff departed, leaving me in the echoing quiet, I was hunched over the main screen, a new sequence of symbols glowing with an unsettling luminescence. My eyes, dry and aching, traced the unfamiliar glyphs. I looked up not at the screen but at the far wall of the lab where a framed photograph of the station's original construction hung crookedly. The photograph, usually a static image of concrete and steel against a stormy sky, seemed to waver. The lines of the building's foundation, the sharp angles of the cranes, began to soften, to blur. The storm clouds in the background, instead of being painted grays and blues, swirled with impossible hues deep, bruised purples and sickly greens that pulsed with an inner light. The edges of the frame itself seemed to melt, the image expanding, encroaching on the wall, the room, my very vision. The concrete structures twisted, not like a building collapsing, but like something living, something in agony, its forms dissolving into a chaotic tapestry of impossible geometries. My breath hitched, my hands, trembling slightly, pressed against the cold metal of the console. The thrum in my chest intensified, resonating with the impossible sight before me. I squeezed my eyes shut, counted to 10, then opened them again. The photograph was back to normal, a mundane image of a building, fixed and still. Was I truly losing my grip as the head of research had implied, and what would happen when the veneer finally tore completely? Unstable. The word echoed, hollow in the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the insistent hum of the dormant equipment. They saw a man losing his grip, chasing phantoms in the cosmic static. I saw clarity, a terrifying, undeniable truth shimmering just beyond the veil of their limited understanding. It meant freedom. I returned to my console, the screen still glowing with the intricate patterns of the signal. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the growing ache in my neck and the taste of stale coffee. I reran the algorithms, tweaked the filters, inverted the data streams. Each permutation yielded the same impossible complexity, the same non-random, non-natural signature. It wasn't just a pattern, it was a language, albeit one utterly alien to any human construct. Before, I'd approached it as a phenomenon to observe, to categorize, to understand through the lens of astrophysics. But now, after their pronouncements, after the solitude had truly set in, a different interpretation began to take root. The signal wasn't merely there, it was reaching. It wasn't just emanating, it was directed. The nuanced shifts in its frequency, the subtle modulations that had previously seemed like mere noise, now resonated with an intentionality I couldn't ignore. It was a beacon, a lure, a whispered invitation across the vast, lightless ocean of the void. A call, a beckoning. To me, why me? What had I done to deserve such an impossible connection? The air in the lab grew heavy, charged with something beyond the usual ozone scent of electronics. I could hear the constant, deep thrum of the facility, a low vibration that seemed to travel through the soles of my feet. Outside, the unyielding roar of the ocean was a constant presence, a reminder of the raw power that shaped this desolate stretch of land. I was at the cliffside research station, waves crashing, radio static filling the quiet moments between my own strained breaths. The static, usually an annoyance, now seemed to carry a subtle rhythm, a counterpoint to the signal's own intricate dance. It was as if the very environment was beginning to resonate with the impossible presence I was tracking. My fingers hovered over the controls, a tremor running through them. To simply observe was no longer enough. The call demanded a response. It demanded a deeper immersion, a surrender to the unknown. My colleagues, in their sterile scientific certainty, would have recoiled from such a notion. They would have called it madness, perhaps it was. But the alternative, to turn away, to ignore this cosmic summons, felt like a betrayal of something fundamental, something that had chosen me. I began to sketch out a new configuration, a radical departure from standard protocols. My current instruments were designed for passive reception, for listening from a safe distance. What I needed was a way to actively engage, to open a channel not just for data, but for communion. It involved bypassing several safety protocols, rerouting power directly from the station's core grid, and configuring the primary parabolic dish not just as a receiver, but as a focused, amplified conduit. The risks were immense. Overload, feedback loops that could fry every circuit board, or worse, feedback loops that could fry something in me. My hands moved with a frantic, almost autonomous energy. Soldering irons hissed. Wires, thick as ropes, were stripped and reconnected. The hum of the equipment intensified, a low growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Sweat beaded on my forehead, stinging my eyes. I didn't stop to eat, barely stopped to drink. The world outside the lab faded into an indistinct blur. There was only the signal and my desperate, dangerous attempt to answer its silent plea. The final connections were made, the last circuit engaged. The console glowed with an unnerving intensity. The air crackled. A strange warmth spread through my chest, not unpleasant but unsettling, like a phantom limb awakening. My vision blurred at the edges, the lines of the monitors wavering. Was it fatigue or something else beginning to seep in? I placed my hand on the primary control panel, the metal cool beneath my palm. Yet I felt an electric current thrumming through me. This wasn't just about amplifying the signal anymore. It was about becoming a part of it, about allowing its immense alien intelligence to flow directly into my own mind, unfiltered, unshielded. What would it reveal? What would it do? I took a deep, shuddering breath and initiated the sequence. The lab lights flickered, dimmed, then surged with a blinding intensity. The screens flared, the patterns of the signal no longer just visible, but vibrating with a new, terrifying life. My head swam. The warmth in my chest intensified, spreading, becoming a pressure, a vast, expanding presence within my skull. The waves crashing outside seemed to pound directly inside my ears, synchronized with the throbbing in my temples. What would be left of me when the connection was complete? Unstable. The word echoed hollow in the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the relentless whoosh crash of the waves against the cliffside below, and the low, persistent hiss-crackle of the radio static from the array of monitors. They thought I was broken. I knew I was merely seeing what they refused to. My hands, though still trembling slightly from the confrontation, moved with a renewed, almost desperate precision over the console. The air in the lab was thick with the tang of ozone and the faint, briny scent of the sea that permeated even these sealed walls. They had cut my access to the main observatory's processing power, but they hadn't cut me off. Not entirely. I still had my personal setup, jury-rigged and humming with an almost defiant energy. I adjusted the last dial, a small, worn knob that felt familiar under my fingertips. The static on the auxiliary receiver intensified, a harsher, more insistent rasp, but beneath it, the faint, complex patterns of the signal grew clearer. It wasn't just data anymore, it was a presence, an awareness. They called it an anomaly, I called it a voice. My breath hitched. The low thrum of the equipment seemed to deepen, resonating not just in the room but within my own chest. I leaned closer to the main screen, the green lines of the waveform pulsing with an unnatural rhythm. It wasn't merely a pattern of energy. It was a language, a complex, layered communication that spoke directly to some deeper, older part of my brain, bypassing all logic. My temples began to throb. The incessant whoosh crash of the waves outside the cliffside research station seemed to morph, becoming a slow, deliberate inhale and exhale of something gargantuan, something that had been sleeping for eons. The radio static was no longer just noise. It was a veil, thinning, shimmering. Then it hit me. Not a sound, not a visual, but a pressure, a crushing infinite weight that seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere all at once. My vision swam. The familiar confines of my lab blurred at the edges, the walls seeming to stretch and contract like some impossible membrane. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight, my entire body rigid. This wasn't a form in any sense I understood. A geometry that defied all spatial reasoning, a concept that tore at the very fabric of my perception. It was vastness, not the vastness of space, but the vastness of idea. An intelligence so utterly alien, so utterly indifferent that my mind screamed in silent protest. It wasn't observing, it was the observation. It wasn't thinking, it was the thought. My breath grew shallow, ragged. I saw, or rather perceived, a slow, deliberate unfolding, not a physical motion, but a conceptual one. The signal wasn't a message to me. It was a ripple from it. Its purpose wasn't to communicate, but to exist, and in its existence to reshape. The universe, as I understood it, was merely a canvas, a malleable medium for its incomprehensible design. Humanity, all our history, our aspirations, our very existence, was less than a speck of dust, an ephemeral motes caught in the slow, inevitable currents of its cosmic will. We weren't even an afterthought, we were just there, for now. The static from the radio receiver seemed to shriek, a cacophony that grated against my teeth, vibrating through my bones. The waves crashing below sounded like the gnawing of bedrock, the slow, grinding erosion of reality itself. My thoughts became fragmented, slipping away like sand through my fingers. The entity didn't have a plan in the human sense. It simply was, and in its being it changed everything. It wasn't hostile, not truly. Hostility implied a recognition of something to oppose. This was beyond such petty concerns. It was the slow, inexorable turning of a cosmic wheel, and we were merely caught beneath it. My head snapped back, hitting the wall behind me with a dull thud. The impact barely registered. My eyes were wide, staring at nothing, seeing everything. The lab, the equipment, the distant ocean all seemed to flicker, to lose their solidity, their permanence. I was a tiny, insignificant observer, privy to a truth that was never meant for human minds. A truth that was not only terrifying, but also utterly, profoundly lonely. What did it mean to discover that everything I believed, everything I was just an accident, a transient pattern in a design so vast it rendered I invisible? What did it mean to know the universe was not for us? And what did it intend to do with its canvas next? Unstable. The word echoed hollow. In the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the insistent hum of the server racks. I leaned back in my chair, the plastic protesting softly, and stared at the flickering display of the signal. They saw static. I saw a presence. How could they be so blind? The answer, I was beginning to realize, wasn't blindness. It was a kind of protection, a natural filter that most minds possessed. A filter I had, in my relentless pursuit, somehow dismantled. My fingers twitched, brushing the cold metal of the console. Outside, the perpetual gray of the afternoon sky pressed against the reinforced windows of the cliffside research station. Waves crashing, radio static a low, constant companion to my isolation. But today, the gray felt different, thicker. I walked to the window, my reflection a pale, gaunt ghost in the glass. The ocean churned far below, its usual deep sapphire now a bruised, murky purple. The waves, typically a rhythmic roar, seemed to possess an unnatural violence, slamming against the rock face with a sound that resonated deep in my bones, a sound that wasn't just water meeting stone. It was a lament or a warning. I pressed my palm against the cool pane, feeling a faint vibration that wasn't from the wind. Was it the ground, or something else entirely? The peculiar shift in the sky wasn't confined to my view. Reports began to trickle in, at first dismissed as atmospheric anomalies. A colleague mentioned a sunset that bled indigo and viridian, colors that defied any known spectrum. Another spoke of a persistent, low-frequency thrumming sound heard across the nearby town, like a gargantuan engine struggling to start, a sound that rattled teeth and frayed nerves, yet left no trace on conventional sensors. The world outside, the one I had so carefully detached myself from, was starting to fray at the edges. I found myself increasingly drawn to the break room, not for coffee, but for the muted chatter of the others. Their voices, once clear and rational, now seemed laden with an undercurrent of something indefinable. The usual banter had thinned, replaced by hushed conversations, nervous glances, and a pervasive unease that clung to the air like a damp shroud. I saw a junior researcher meticulously arranging sugar packets into a complex, geometric pattern on the table, his eyes wide and unfocused, a tremor in his hand. He wasn't playing, he was compelled. A cleaning staff member, usually humming cheerful tunes, stood staring out a window at the roiling sea, her face slack, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. When I asked if he was all right, she merely shook her head, her gaze fixed on the horizon, as if expecting something terrible to rise from the depths. What did she see that I couldn't? My own clarity felt like a curse. I recognized the subtle distortion in their expressions, the slight delay in their reactions, the way their conversations would sometimes veer into non sequiturs, only to be hastily corrected, as if a thought had momentarily fractured. It wasn't madness, not in the clinical sense. It was something far more insidious. Their minds, like mine, were being subtly retuned, their perceptions nudged off-kilter by an unseen hand. I felt the pressure, a faint, persistent hum behind my own eyes, a constant awareness of the signal's insidious tendrils reaching out, touching everything. It had begun with me, a conduit, and now it was bleeding into the world. It wasn't just white noise. I would lean in, my ear almost touching the speaker, my breath held captive in my chest, trying to make sense of the swirling chaos. Was it a voice, or merely the sound of reality itself beginning to tear? The head of research, the man who had dismissed me, passed my lab door one evening. His shoulders were slumped, his usual confident stride replaced by a shuffling gait. He didn't look in. He just walked past, his face pale, his eyes distant, as if burdened by a crushing weight. He wasn't unstable. He was aware. Not fully, perhaps, not with the horrifying clarity I possessed, but the veil was thinning for him too. The entity wasn't just speaking to me anymore. It was singing to the world, a discordant, alien lullaby that promised to reshape everything. What would happen when the lullaby turned into a scream? Unstable. The word echoed hollow in the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the insistent hum of the equipment and the distant, rhythmic growl of the waves crashing against the base of the cliffside research station. They were wrong. I knew they were wrong. My determination, far from being dampened by their dismissal, had hardened into a brittle, desperate resolve. I turned back to the console, fingers hovering over the controls. The signal, my impossible signal, was still there, a faint, almost subliminal resonance beneath the usual radio static. It wasn't just a frequency, it was a presence, a weight in the air I'd grown accustomed to. But now, after the last data bursts, after the strange, almost organic pattern shifts I'd observed, it felt closer, much closer. A low thrum began to vibrate through the floor, a frequency too deep for human ears. Yet I felt it, a pressure against my sternum. The lights in the lab flickered, not a sudden cut, but a slow, deliberate dimming, then brightening like a giant, unseen eyelid opening and closing. I pressed a hand to the cold metal of the console, my grip tight. This wasn't a power surge. This was it. The radio static wasn't just static anymore. It twisted, coalesced, forming faint, almost discernible patterns within its hiss and crackle. I leaned closer, straining to hear, to understand. It wasn't words, not in any language I knew, but a shifting tapestry of sound that seemed to speak directly to the deepest, most primal parts of my brain. My temples began to throb, a dull ache that quickly intensified, like something was pressing outwards from inside my skull. Then the room began to breathe. I saw it first in the reflection on the monitor screen. The straight lines of the laboratory wall behind me seemed to waver, to soften, as if the very plaster was melting. I spun around. The wall was still there, concrete and steel, but the corner where it met the ceiling seemed to have, rounded just slightly, an impossible curve where there should have been a sharp angle. My breath hitched. I squeezed my eyes shut, then opened them. The corner was sharp again. I blinked. No, it was still rounded, but only if I didn't focus directly on it. My peripheral vision caught the impossible geometry, a subtle, nauseating distortion of space itself. My stomach lurched. I stumbled back, knocking against my chair. The waves crashing outside the station now sounded different too. Not the familiar roar and hiss, but a deep, mournful moan that seemed to carry an infinite sorrow, a sound that bypassed my ears and resonated directly in my bones. It was the sound of something vast and ancient stirring, not just the ocean, but the very planet beneath my feet. I moved to the reinforced window, peering out into the twilight. The horizon, usually a clean, sharp line where the bruised sky met the churning sea, was now subtly warped. It wasn't a straight line anymore. It dipped and rose in impossible undulations like a vast, slow wave frozen in mid-motion. The distant lights of a passing ship, usually tiny pinpricks, seemed to stretch and smear, becoming elongated blurs of color, as if the light itself was struggling to maintain its form. My hands trembled as I reached for the comms panel, trying to raise someone, anyone. The general channel crackled, then erupted in a cacophony of sound. Not voices, not alarms, but a terrifying symphony of distorted, panicked cries, guttural shouts, and then it was as if the world outside had just stopped, or perhaps had changed so fundamentally that normal communication was no longer possible. I tried to call the head of research, then the colleague. Nothing. Just the continued, unsettling radio static, now layered with an almost imperceptible, high-pitched whine that felt like it was scraping against the inside of my teeth. This wasn't just a signal anymore. This was a presence asserting itself. It wasn't a scientific anomaly, it was a resculpting. The metallic scent intensified, now mixed with something acrid like burnt iron. The thrumming vibration grew stronger, rattling the beakers on my workbench, making the monitors judder. It felt full, dense, pressing in from all sides, like the unlocking of an unimaginably ancient door. My knees buckled. I gripped the edge of the console, gripped tight. The impossible geometries outside the window intensified, the horizon now a jagged, chaotic line that defied all physics, the waves below glowing with an unnatural phosphorescence. The cliffside research station itself groaned, a sound of stressed metal and twisting rock. It was no longer just a building. It was a vessel being reshaped, remade, the true awakening. It wasn't just a signal anymore. It was here, and it was hungry. What would be left of me or anything once it had fully awakened? Unstable. The word echoed hollow in the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the insistent hum of the equipment. They didn't understand. They couldn't. Their minds were too small, too rooted in the neat, bounded universe they'd constructed for themselves. My universe had no such boundaries. It was vast, ancient, and humming with something they refused to acknowledge. I turned back to my console, my fingers hovering over the glowing controls. The air in the lab felt thick, charged. Outside, I knew the wind howled, whipping spray from the ocean against the reinforced windows of the cliffside research station, waves crashing, radio static a constant, almost comforting background drone. But tonight, the static felt different. It was less a barrier to sound, more a thin veil over something else, something trying to push through. My dismissal, their scorn, it only fueled my resolve. I would show them, or perhaps I would show myself. My eyes fell on the primary receiver, its indicator light pulsing a faint, rhythmic blue. The signal. It was still there, unwavering, even after all the power fluctuations, all the attempts to filter it, to rationalize it away. It wasn't an anomaly. It was a presence, a vast, patient awareness that had been waiting, perhaps for eons, for a mind receptive enough to truly listen. I felt a tremor run through my hands, not of fear, but of an awful anticipation. I brought the audio feed live, bypassing the usual dampeners. It was no longer just white noise. It was structured. It was language. My teeth began to ache. A low thrum started in my chest, a counter-rhythm to the signal's pulse. It felt like my very bones were trying to realign themselves to an unheard frequency. Could the others have ever felt this, even for a moment, before shutting it down? My vision seemed to sharpen, the edges of objects in the room becoming unnaturally crisp, almost painful to look at. The dust motes suspended in the air, caught in the weak light, seemed to move with intent, swirling in miniature eddies, following the unseen currents of the signal. I was no longer merely observing, I was being observed through. My breath hitched. My mind felt like a stretched membrane, taut and vibrating, threatening to tear. I could feel thoughts that weren't mine, vast, slow, incomprehensible concepts brushing against the edges of my consciousness. They were not malicious, not benevolent, simply other. My human self, the Raj who built equations and analyzed data, felt infinitesimally small, dissolving. A strange warmth began to spread from my temples, down my neck, and into my shoulders. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was alien. My skin tingled, not with pins and needles, but with a sensation of being gently, yet irrevocably, unwoven. My perception of the room blurred, then sharpened again, but this time the sharpening was different. I saw not just the surfaces of things, but the underlying structures, the faint energetic currents that bound them together. The metal of the console, the glass of the window, the very air itself, it all shimmered with a hidden geometry, a fractal complexity I had never before perceived. The universe was not empty, it was teeming with patterns beyond human comprehension. The static from the speakers was now a roaring current, a flood of pure information. It flowed into me, bypassing my ears, my brain, entering my very being. My eyes, I knew, were wide, unblinking. I couldn't feel my eyelids. The hum in my chest intensified, becoming a resonant vibration that seemed to align with the core of the planet, with the distant pulse of the signal itself. I was no longer Raj, the astrophysicist. I was a conduit, a receiver. The reveal was not a picture or a vision, but a knowing, an instantaneous download of an elder truth. The universe was not born of a single point, but was a dream, a thought, of entities so vast, so ancient, that stars were merely motes of dust in their slumbering minds. And they were waking. My previous understanding of physics, of reality, shattered like fragile glass. It was all a construct, a fleeting illusion. My fingers twitched, then moved with an unnerving grace across the console, not manipulating controls, but caressing them, drawing out new frequencies, new patterns from the equipment, as if the machines themselves had become extensions of my new, expanded awareness. The sounds of the cliffside research station, waves crashing, radio static outside the lab seemed to meld with the signal, becoming part of the same vast, intricate symphony. A sense of belonging that transcended anything human. My identity had fractured, reformed around an alien core. I was an observer, yes, but also a participant, a worshipper, perhaps. The transformation was complete. I stood, my body feeling lighter, yet more substantial, as if infused with a different kind of matter. My mouth was a thin line, incapable of forming human words for what I now understood. What would they see if they looked at me now? Unstable. The word echoed hollow in the quiet of my isolated lab, a faint counterpoint to the insistent hum of the processors. They thought they knew. They thought they understood the boundaries of sanity, the limits of what a human mind could comprehend. They were wrong, terribly, beautifully wrong. My fingers twitched, itching to touch the console, to re-engage with the signal that pulsed just beyond their understanding. The cliffside research station groaned around me, a low, resonant sigh against the relentless waves crashing far below. It was a sound I'd grown accustomed to, a backdrop to countless sleepless nights spent chasing ghosts in the data. Now it felt like a living thing, a giant beast settling into an uneasy slumber, or perhaps stirring from one. My dismissal had bought me time, ironically. I powered up the primary receiver, the complex array of screens flickering to life with their familiar cascade of incomprehensible symbols and fluctuating waveforms. The radio static, ever-present, hissed from the auxiliary speaker, a white noise blanket that usually soothed. Tonight it felt like a veil, thin and fragile, about to be torn. My hands, steady despite the tremor in my chest, adjusted the filters. The signal, which they'd called an anomaly, a fluke, swelled into focus. It was stronger tonight, more vibrant, its patterns shifting with a dizzying complexity that defied all algorithms I'd ever designed. It was a presence, a voice without a mouth, a mind without a brain, speaking directly into the core of my being. My skin prickled, 1,000 tiny needles tracing invisible paths across my scalp. The air in the lab grew heavy, thick with an unseen pressure. The usual metallic tang of ozone from the equipment sharpened, replaced by something else, something akin to wet earth and distant lightning. A smell that had no business being indoors. The ocean, usually a churning expanse of gray and black under the moonless sky, seemed to shimmer with an unnatural, phosphorescent glow. The waves crashing sounded different now, not just water against rock, but something deeper, a guttural exhalation, a sigh from a colossal lung. I leaned closer to the main screen. The waveforms were no longer just lines, they were forming intricate fractal geometries that pulsed with an internal light. My vision blurred at the edges. My eyes, dry and aching, refused to tear. A dull throb began behind my temples, a slow, relentless drumbeat that seemed to synchronize with the rhythm of the signal itself. It was as if my brain was trying to rewire itself to accommodate a new kind of input, a new way of seeing. The radio static on the speaker wasn't static anymore. They were a language of pure concept, seeping into my thoughts without the need for translation. I understood. Not with my intellect, but with a deeper, more primal part of me that had been dormant until now. It was a consciousness not merely observing, but transforming. My breath hitched. The walls of the cliffside research station seemed to breathe with me, their concrete surfaces rippling slightly, an impossible undulation that made my stomach churn. The floor beneath my feet felt less solid, more yielding like compacted soil. I gripped the edge of the console, my grip tight, but even the plastic felt different, softer, almost organic. It pulsed with a faint warmth. I looked down at my hands. They were still my hands, but the lines on my palms seemed deeper, more numerous, forming patterns I didn't recognize. My skin itself felt stretched, thin, as if the very cells were vibrating at a different frequency. The transformation wasn't external. Not yet. It was happening within me, within the very fabric of my perception. The world wasn't changing. My ability to perceive its true nature was simply being peeled back, layer by agonizing layer. The waves crashing outside had become a rhythm of immense, slow, deliberate thought. The radio static was the entity's breath, its voice. I felt a profound shift, a dissolving of boundaries. My identity, my memories, my very sense of self began to fray at the edges, dissolving into the vast, shimmering tapestry of the signal. I was no longer Raj, the isolated astrophysicist. I was a point of awareness, a ripple in an ocean of incomprehensible consciousness. The head of research and the colleague, they were just echoes of a fleeting dream. Humanity, a whisper in the roar of true existence. The glass of the window began to weep, not with condensation, but with a viscous, shimmering fluid that ran like slow tears, leaving trails of iridescent slime. Beyond it, the ocean was no longer water. It was a shifting, living membrane, reflecting the impossible geometries of the signal in its depths. I felt no fear now, only an immense, terrifying calm. The distinction between myself and the signal had vanished. I was the receiver, the transmitter, the message itself. My body was still here, slumped over the console, but my mind was elsewhere, everywhere. It was watching the universe unfurl, not as a collection of stars and galaxies, but as a single, colossal entity stirring from an eon-long slumber. The Cliffside Research Station was no longer a building. It was part of the entity's waking form, a bone in its vast, growing skeleton. The waves crashing were its heartbeat, and the radio static was its eternal song. What would happen when it fully awoke?